Talk. Triumph of policy and fall of the minister. 1846. Change of opinion, in those to whose judgment the public looks more or less to assist its own, is an evil to the country, although a much smaller evil than their persistence in a course which they know to be wrong. It is not always to be blamed. But it is always to be watched with vigilance, always to be challenged and put upon its trial. Gladstone. Not lingering for the moment on Mr. Gladstone's varied preoccupations during 1845, and not telling over again the well-known story of the circumstances that led to the repeal of the Corn Law, I pass rapidly to Mr. Gladstone's part. It was a secondary part in the closing act of the exciting political drama on which the curtain had risen in 1841. The end of the session of 1845 had left the government in appearance even stronger than it was in the beginning of 1842. Two of the most sagacious actors knew better what this was worth. Disraeli was aware how the ties had been loosened between the minister and his supporters, and Cobden was aware that, in words used at the time, 3 weeks of rain when the wheat was ripening would rain away the Corn Law. 172. An exciting December. Everybody knows how the rain came, and alarming signs of a dreadful famine in Ireland came, how Peel advised his cabinet to open the ports for a limited period, but without promising them that if the corn duties were ever taken off, they could ever be put on again, how Lord John seized the moment, wrote an Edinburgh letter, and declared for total and immediate repeal, how the minister once more called his cabinet together, invited them to support him in settling the question, and as they would not all assent, resigned, how Lord John tried to form a government and failed, and how Sir Robert again became First Minister of the Crown, but not bringing all his colleagues back with him. I think, said Mr. Gladstone in later days, he expected to carry the repeal of the Corn Law without breaking up his party, but meant at all hazard to carry it. Peel's conduct in 1846, Lord Aberdeen said to a friend 10 years later, was very noble. With the exception of Graham and myself, his whole cabinet was against him. Lyndhurst, Goulburn, and Stanley were almost violent in their resistance. Still more opposed to him, if it were possible, was the Duke of Wellington. To break up the cabinet was an act of great courage. To resume office when Lord John had failed in constructing one was still more courageous. He said to the Queen, "I am ready to kiss hands as your minister tonight. I believe I can collect a ministry which will last long enough to carry free trade, and I am ready to make the attempt." When he said this, there were only 2 men on whom he could rely. One of the first to join him was Wellington. "The Queen's government," he said, "must be carried on. We have done all that we could for the landed interest. Now we must do all that we can for the Queen." 173. On one of the days of this startling December, Mr. Gladstone writes to his father, "If Peel determines to form a government, and if he sends for me, a compound uncertainty, I cannot judge what to do until I know much more than at present of the Irish case. It is there if anywhere that he must find his justification, there if anywhere that one returned to Parliament as I am, can honestly find reason for departing at this time from the present Corn Law." 2 other letters of Mr. Gladstone's show us more fully why he followed Peel instead of joining the dissensions, of whom the most important was Lord Stanley. The first of these was written to his father 4.5 years later. 6. Carlton Gardens, June 30, 1849. As respects my having made Peel a free trader, I have never seen that idea expressed anywhere, and I think it is one that does great injustice to the character and power of his mind. In every case, however, the head of a government may be influenced more or less in the affairs of each department of state by the person in charge of that department. If, then, there was any influence at all upon Peel's mind proceeding from me between 1841 and 1845, I have no doubt it may have tended on the whole towards free trade. But all this ceased with the measures of 1845, when I left office. It was during the alarm of a potato famine in the autumn of that year that the movement in the government about the Corn Laws began. I was then on the continent, looking after Helen, his sister, and not dreaming of office or public affairs. I myself had invariably, during Peel's government, spoken of protection not as a thing good in principle, but to be dealt with as tenderly and cautiously as might be according to circumstances, always moving in the direction of free trade. It then appeared to me that the case was materially altered by events. It was no longer open to me to pursue that cautious course. A great struggle was imminent, in which it was plain that two parties only could really find place, on the one side for repeal, on the other side for permanent maintenance of a corn law and a protective system generally and on principle. It would have been more inconsistent in me, even if consistency had been the rule, to join the latter party than the former. But independently of that, I thought, and still think, that the circumstances of the case justified and required the change. So far as relates to the final change in the corn law, you will see that no influence proceeded from me, but rather that events over which I had no control, and steps taken by Sir Peel while I was out of the government, had an influence upon me in inducing me to take office. I noticed some days ago that you had made an observation on this subject, but I did not recollect that it was a question. Had I adverted to this, I should have answered it at once. If I had any motive for avoiding the subject, it was, I think, this, that it is not easy to discuss such a question as that of an influence of mine over a mind so immeasurably superior, without something of egotism and vanity. Secretary of State. So much for the general situation. The second letter is to Mrs. Gladstone, and contributes some personal details. 13, Carlton House Terrace, December 22, 6 p.m., 1845. It is offensive to begin about myself, but I must. Within the last 2 hours I have accepted the office of Secretary for the Colonies, succeeding Lord Stanley, who resigns. The last 24 have been very anxious hours. Yesterday afternoon, 2 hours after Holy Communion, Lincoln came to make an appointment on Peel's part. I went to meet him in Lincoln's house at 5 o'clock. He detailed to me the circumstances connected with the late political changes, asked me for no reply, and gave me quantities of papers to read, including letters of his own, the Queen's, and Lord J. Russell's, during the crisis. This morning I had a conversation with Bonham, the party whipper-in, upon the general merits, but without telling him precisely what the proposal made to me was. Upon the whole my mind, though I felt the weight of the question, was clear. I had to decide what was best to be done now. I arrived speedily at the conviction that now, at any rate, it is best that the question should be finally settled, that Peel ought and is bound now to try it, that I ought to support it in Parliament, that if, in deciding the mode, he endeavours to include the most favourable terms for the agricultural body that it is in his power to obtain, I ought not only to support it, by which I mean vote for it in Parliament, but likewise not to refuse to be a party to the proposal. I found from him that he entirely recognized this view, and did feel himself bound to make the best terms that he believed attainable, while, on the other hand, I am convinced that we are now in a position that requires provision to be made for the final abolition of the Corn Law. Such being the state of matters, with a clear conscience, but with a heavy heart, I accepted office. He was exceedingly warm and kind. But it was with a heavy heart. I have seen Lord Stanley. I am extremely glad to hear you have taken office, said he. We go to Windsor tomorrow to a council, he to resign the seals, and I to receive them. In the diary he enters. Saw Sir Peel at 3, and accepted office in opposition, as I have the consolation of feeling, to my leanings and desires, and with the most precarious prospects. Peel was most kind, nay fatherly. We held hands instinctively, and I could not but reciprocate with emphasis his God bless you. I well remember, Mr. Gladstone wrote in a memorandum of October 4, 1851, Peel's using language to me in the Duke of Newcastle's house on Sunday, December 21, 1845, which, as I conceive, distinctly intimated his belief that he would be able to carry his measure, and at the same time hold his party together. He spoke with a kind of glee and complacency in his tone when he said, making up his meaning by signs, I have not lived near 40 years in public life to find myself wholly without the power of foreseeing the course of events in the House of Commons in reference to the very point of the success of his government. One thing is worth noting as we pass. The exact proceedings of the memorable cabinets of November and the opening days of December are still obscure. It has generally been held that Disraeli planted a rather awkward stroke when he taunted Peel with his inconsistency in declaring that he was not the proper minister to propose repeal, and yet in trying to persuade his colleagues to make the attempt before giving the Whigs a chance. The following note of Mr. Gladstone's, written in 1851 after reading Sir R. Peel's original memoir on the Corn Act of 1846, throws some light on the question. When Sir R. Peel invited me to take office in December 1845, he did not make me aware of the offer he had made to the Cabinet in his memorandum, I think of December 2, to propose a new corn law with a lowered sliding duty, which should diminish annually by $1 until in some 8 or 10 years the trade would be free. No doubt he felt that after Lord John Russell had made his attempt to form a government, and after, by Lord Stanley's resignation, he had lost the advantages of unanimity, he could not be justified in a proposal involving so considerable an element of protection. It has become matter of history. But as matter of history, it is important to show how honestly and perseveringly he strove to hold the balance fairly between contending claims, and how far he was from being the mere puppet of abstract theories. That is to say, what he proposed to his cabinet early in December was not the total and immediate repeal to which he was led by events before the end of the month. 2. Out of Parliament. The acceptance of office vacated the seat at Newark, and Mr. Gladstone declined to offer himself again as a candidate. He had been member for Newark for 13 years, and had been 5 times elected. So ended his connection with the first of the 5 constituencies that in his course he represented. I part from my constituents, he tells his father, with deep regret. Though I took office under circumstances which might reasonably arouse the jealousy of my friends, an agricultural constituency, the great majority of my committee were prepared to support me, and took action and strong measures in my favor. My deep obligation, he says, to the Duke of Newcastle for the great benefit he conferred upon me, not only by his unbroken support, but, far above all, by his original introduction of me to the constituency, made it my duty at once to decline some overtures made to me for the support of my re-election, so it only remained to seek a seat elsewhere. Some faint hopes were entertained by Mr. Gladstone's friends that the Duke might allow him to sit for the rest of the Parliament, but the Duke was not the man to make concessions to a betrayer of the territorial interest. Mr. Gladstone, too, we must not forget, was still and for many years to come, a Tory. When it was suggested that he might stand for North Notts, he wrote to Lord Lincoln, "It is not for one of my political opinions without an extreme necessity to stand upon the basis of democratic or popular feeling against the local proprietary. For you who are placed in the soil the case is very different." Soon after the session of 1846 began, it became known that the protectionist petition against the Peelite or Liberal sitting member for Wigan was likely to succeed in unseating him. Proposals were made to me to succeed him, which were held to be eligible. I even wrote my address. On a certain day, I was going down by the mail train. But it was an object for our opponents to keep a Secretary of State out of Parliament during the Corn Law crisis, and their petition was suddenly withdrawn. The consequence was that I remained until the resignation of the government in July a minister of the Crown without a seat in Parliament. This was a state of things not agreeable to the spirit of parliamentary government, and some objection was taken, but rather slightly, in the House of Commons. Sir R. Peel stood fire. There can be little doubt that in our own day a cabinet minister without a seat in either House of Parliament would be regarded, in Mr. Gladstone's words, as a public inconvenience and a political anomaly, too dark to be tolerated, and he naturally felt it his absolute duty to peep in at every chink and cranny where a seat in Parliament could be had. A Peelite, however, had not a good chance at a by-election, and Mr. Gladstone remained out of the House until the general election in the year following. 174, Lord Lincoln, also a member of the Cabinet, vacated his seat, but, unlike his friend, found a seat in the course of the session. Mr. Gladstone's brother-in-law, Littleton, was invited to represent the Colonial Office in the Lords, but had qualms of conscience about the eternal question of the 2 Welsh bishoprics. How could the government of this wonderful empire, Peel wrote to Mr. Gladstone, be ever constructed, if a difference on such a point were to be an obstruction to union. Might not anyone now say with perfect honor and, what is of more importance, if they are not identical, perfect satisfaction to his own conscience, I will not so far set up my own judgment on one isolated measure against that of a whole administration, to such an extent as to preclude me from cooperation with them at a critical period. This, of course, assumes general accordance of sentiment on the great outlines of public policy. Wise words and sound, that might prevent some of the worst mistakes of some of the best men. 3. The Session of 1846. This memorable session of 1846 was not a session of argument, but of lobby computations. The case had been argued to the dregs, the conclusion was fixed, and all interest was centered in the play of forces, the working of high motives and low, the balance of parties, the secret ambitions and antagonism of persons. Mr. Gladstone therefore was not in the shaping of the parliamentary results seriously missed, as he had been missed in 1845. It soon became evident, says a leading Whig in his journal of the time, that Peel had very much overrated his strength. Even the expectation of December that he could have carried with him enough of his own followers to enable Lord John, if that statesman had contrived to form a government, to pass the repeal of the Corn Law, was perceived to have been groundless, when the formidable number of the protectionist dissentients appeared. So many even of those who remained with Peel avowed that they disapproved of the measure, and only voted in its favor for the purpose of supporting Peel's government. 175. The tyranny of the accomplished fact obscures one's sense of the danger that Peel's high courage averted. It is not certain that Lord John as head of a government could have carried the whole body of Whigs for total and immediate repeal, Lord Lansdowne and Palmerston openly stating their preference for a fixed duty, and not a few of the smaller men cursing the precipitancy of the Edinburgh letter. It is certain, as is intimated above, that Peel could not have carried over to him the whole of the 112 men who voted for repeal solely because it was his measure. In the course of this session Sir John Hobhouse met Mr. Disraeli at an evening party, and expressed a fear lest Peel having broken up one party would also be the means of breaking up the other. That, you may depend upon it, he will, replied Disraeli, or any other party that he has anything to do with. It was not long after this, when all was over, that the Duke of Wellington told Lord John that he thought Peel was tired of party and was determined to destroy it. After the repeal of the Corn Law was safe, the minister was beaten on the Irish Coercion Bill by what Wellington called a blackguard combination between the Whigs and the Protectionists. He resigned, and Lord John Russell at the head of the Whigs came in. Until 3 or 4 days before the division on the Coercion Bill, Mr. Gladstone says in a memorandum written at the time, I had not the smallest idea, beyond mere conjecture, of the views and intentions of Sir Ard Peel with respect to himself or to his government. Only we had been governed in all questions, so far as I knew, by the determination to carry the Corn Bill and to let no collateral circumstance interfere with that main purpose. He sent round a memorandum some days before the division arguing for resignation against dissolution. There was also a correspondence between the Duke of Wellington and him. The Duke argued for holding our ground and dissolving. But when we met in Cabinet on Friday the 26th of June, not an opposing voice was raised. It was the shortest Cabinet I ever knew. Peel himself uttered 2 or 3 introductory sentences. He then said that he was convinced that the formation of a Conservative party was impossible while he continued in office. That he had made up his mind to resign. That he strongly advised the resignation of the entire government. Some declared their assent. None objected, and when he asked whether it was unanimous, there was no voice in the negative. This was simply, as Mr. Gladstone added in later notes, because he had very distinctly and positively stated his own resolution to resign. It amounted therefore to this: no one proposed to go on without him. One other note of Mr. Gladstone's on this grave decision is worth quoting. I must put into words the opinion which I silently formed in my room at the Colonial Office in June 1846, when I got the circulation box with Peel's own memorandum not only arguing in favor of resignation but intimating his own intention to resign, and with the Duke of Wellington's in the opposite sense. The Duke, in my opinion, was right and Peel wrong, but he had borne the brunt of battle already beyond the measure of human strength, and who can wonder that his heart and soul as well as his physical organization needed rest? 176. Defeat of the government. In announcing his retirement to the House, June 29, Peel passed a magnanimous and magnificent eulogium on Cobden. 177. Strange to say, the panegyric gave much offence, and among others to Mr. Gladstone. The next day he entered in his diary. Much comment is made upon Peel's declaration about Cobden last night. My objection to it is that it did not do full justice. For if his power of discussion has been great and his end good, his tone has been most harsh and his imputation of bad and vile motives to honorable men incessant. I do not think the thing was done in a manner altogether worthy of Peel's mind. But he, like some smaller men, is, I think, very sensible of the sweetness of the cheers of opponents. He describes himself at the time as grieved and hurt at these closing sentences, and even a year later, in answer to some inquiry from his father, who still remained protectionist, he wrote, July 1, 47, I do not know anything about Peel's having repented of his speech about Cobden, but I hope that he has seen the great objection to which it is, as I think, fairly open. Some of his own men who voted for Peel declared that after this speech they bitterly repented. Peel's tribute to Cobden. The suspected personal significance of the Cobden panegyric is described in a memorandum written by Mr. Gladstone a few days later, July 12. A day or two afterwards I met Lord Stanley crossing the park, and we had some conversation, first on colonial matters. Then he said, Well, I think our friend Peel went rather far last night about Cobden, did he not? I stated to him my very deep regret on reading that passage, as well as what followed about the monopolists, and that, not for its impolicy but for its injustice. All that he said was true, but he did not say the whole truth, and the effect of the whole, as a whole, was therefore untrue. Mr. Cobden has throughout argued the corn question on the principle of holding up the landlords of England to the people, as plunderers, and as knaves for maintaining the corn law to save their rents, and as fools because it was not necessary for that purpose. This was passed by, while he was praised for sincerity, eloquence, indefatigable zeal. On Thursday the 2nd I saw Lord Aberdeen. He agreed in the general regret at the tone of that part of the speech. He said he feared it was designed with a view to its effects, for the purpose of making it impossible that Peel should ever again be placed in connection with the Conservative Party as a party. He said that Peel had absolutely made up his mind never again to lead it, never again to enter office, that he had indeed made up his mind, at one time, to quit Parliament, but that probably on the Queen's account, and in deference to her wishes, he had abandoned this part of his intentions. But that he was fixed in the idea to maintain his independent and separate position, taking part in public questions as his views of public interests might from time to time seem to require. I represented that this for him, and in the House of Commons, was an intention absolutely impossible to fulfill, that with his greatness he could not remain there overshadowing and eclipsing all governments, and yet have to do with no governments, that acts cannot for such a man be isolated, they must be in series, and his view of public affairs must coincide with one body of men rather than another, and that the attraction must place him in relations with them. Lord Aberdeen said that Earl Spencer in his later days was Sir or Peel's ideal, rare appearances for serious purposes, and without compromise generally to the independence of his personal habits. I put it that this was possible in the House of Lords, but only there. On Saturday I saw him again as he came from the palace. He represented that the Queen was sorely grieved at this change, which indeed I had already heard from Catherine through Lady Littleton, but this showed that it continued. And again on Monday we heard through Lady Littleton that the Queen said it was a comfort to think that the work of that day would soon be over. It appears too that she spoke of the kindness she had received from her late ministers, and that the Prince's sentiments are quite as decided. On Monday we delivered up the seals at our several audiences. Her Majesty said simply but very kindly to me, I am very sorry to receive them from you. I thanked her for my father's baronetcy, and apologized for his not coming to court. She had her glove half off, which made me think I was to kiss hands, but she simply bowed and retired. Her eyes told tales, but she smiled and put on a cheerful countenance. It was in fact the 1st of September, 1841 over again as to feelings, but this time with more mature judgment and longer experience. Lord Aberdeen and Sir J. Graham kissed hands, but this was by favour. The same night I saw Sidney Herbert at Lady Pembroke's. He gave me in great part the same view of Sir Peel's speech, himself holding the same opinion with Lord Aberdeen. But he thought that Peel's natural temper, which he said is very violent though usually under thorough discipline, broke out and coloured that part of the speech, but that the end in view was to cut off all possibility of reunion. He referred to a late conversation with Peel, in which Peel had intimated his intention of remaining in Parliament and acting for himself without party, to which Herbert replied that he knew of no minister who had done so except Lord Bute, a bad precedent. Peel rejoined Lord Grenville, showing that his mind had been at work upon the subject. He had heard him not long ago discussing his position with Lord Aberdeen and Sir James Graham, when he said, putting his hand up to the side of his head, "Ah, you do not know what I suffer here. Yesterday Lord Lyndhurst called on me. He proceeded to ask me what I thought with respect to our political course. He said he conceived that the quarrel was a bygone quarrel, that the animosities attending it ought now to be forgotten, and the old relations of amity and confidence among the members of the Conservative body resumed. I told him, in the first place, that I felt some difficulty in answering him in my state of total ignorance, so far as direct communication is concerned, of Sir Peel's knowledge and intentions, that on Tuesday I had seen him on colonial matters, and had talked on the probable intentions of the new government as to the sugar duties, but that I did not like to ask what he did not seem to wish to tell, and that I did not obtain the smallest inkling of light as to his intentions in respect to that very matter now immediately pending. He observed it was a pity Sir Peel was so uncommunicative, but that after having been so long connected with him, he would certainly be very unwilling to do anything disagreeable to him. Still, if I and others thought fit, he was ready to do what he could towards putting the party together again. I then replied that I thought, so far as extinguishing the animosities which had been raised in connection with the Corn Law was concerned, I could not doubt its propriety, that I thought we were bound to give a fair trial to the government, and not to assume beforehand an air of opposition, and that if so much of confidence is due to them, much more is it due towards friends from whom we have differed on the single question of free trade, that our confidence should be reposed in them. That I thought, however, that in any case, before acting together as a party, we ought to consider well the outline of our further course, particularly with reference to Irish questions and the church there, as I was of opinion that it was very doubtful whether we had now a justification for opposing any change with respect to it, meaning as to the property. He said with his accustomed facility, yes, it will require to be considered what course we shall take. 178. Conversations with colleagues. I met Lord Aberdeen the same afternoon in Bond Street, and told him the substance of this conversation. He said, "It is stated that Lord G. E. Bentinck is to resign, and that they are to have you." That, I replied, was quite new to me. The late Chancellor had simply said, when I pointed out that the difficulties lay in the House of Commons, that it was true, and that my being there would make the way more open. I confess I am very doubtful of that, and much disposed to believe that I am regretted, as things in persons absent often are, in comparison with the present. At dinner I sat between Graham and Jocelyn. The latter observed particularly on the absence from Sir Peel's speech of any acknowledgment towards his supporters and his colleagues. These last, however, are named. Jocelyn said the new government were much divided. Jocelyn believes that Lord Palmerston will not be very long in union with this cabinet. With Sir J. Graham I had much interesting conversation. I told him, I thought it but fair to mention to him the regret and blame which I found to have been elicited from all persons whom I saw and conversed with, by the passage relating to Cobden. He said he believed it was the same on all hands, and that the new government in particular were most indignant at it. He feared that it was deliberately preconceived and for the purpose, and went on to repeat what Lord Aberdeen had told me, that Sir R. Peel had been within an ace of quitting Parliament, and was determined to abjure party and stand aloof forever, and never resume office. I replied as before, that in the House of Commons it was impossible. He went on to sketch the same kind of future for himself. He was weary of labor at 13 or 14 hours a day, and of the intolerable abuse to which he was obliged to submit, but his habits were formed in the House of Commons and for it, and he was desirous to continue there as an independent gentleman, taking part from time to time in public business as he might find occasion, and giving his leisure to his family and to books. I said, "Are you not building houses of cards? Do you conceive that men who have played a great part, who have swayed the great moving forces of the state, who have led the House of Commons and given the tone to public policy, cannot there will remain there, but renounce the consequences of their remaining, and refuse to fulfill what must fall to them in some contingency of public affairs? The country will demand that they who are the ablest shall not stand by inactive." He said Sir Robert Peel had all but given up his seat. I answered that would at any rate have made his resolution a practicable one. He said, "You can have no conception of what the virulence is against Peel and me." I said, "No, that from having been out of Parliament during these debates my sense of these things was less lively and my position in some respects different." He replied, "Your position is quite different. You are free to take any course you please with perfect honor." I told him of Lord Lyndhurst's visit and the purport of his conversation, of the meaning of the junction on the opposition bench in the Lords, and of what we had said of the difficulties in the Commons. He said, "My resentment is not against the new government, but against the 73 Conservative members of Parliament who displaced the late government by a factious vote. Nearly all of them believed the bill to be necessary for Ireland, and they knew that our removal was not desired by the Crown, not desired by the country. I find no fault with the new ministers, they are fairly in possession of power, but with those gentlemen I can never unite." Later, however, in the evening he relented somewhat, and said he must admit that what they did was done under great provocation, that it was no wonder they regarded themselves as betrayed, and that unfortunately it had been the fate of Sir R. Peel to perform a similar operation twice. Graham dwelt with fondness and with pain on Lord Stanley, said he had very great qualities, that his speech on the Corn Law, consisting as it did simply of old fallacies though in new dress, was a magnificent speech, one of his greatest and happiest efforts, that all his conduct in the public eye had been perfectly free from exception, that he feared, however, he had been much in Lord Geo. Bentinck's counsels, and had concurred in much more than he had himself done, and had aided in marking out the course taken in the House of Commons. He had called on Lord Stanley several times but had never been able to see him, he trusted through accident, but seemed to doubt. On the Cobden eulogy, though he did not defend it outright by any means, he said, "Do you think if Cobden had not existed the repeal of the Corn Law would have been carried at this moment?" I said very probably not, that he had added greatly to the force of the movement and accelerated its issue, that I admitted the truth of every word that Peel had uttered, but complained of its omissions, of its spirit towards his own friends, of its false moral effect, as well as in much more than of its mere impolicy. 179. 4. Farewell interview with Peel. Still more interesting is an interview with the fallen minister himself, written 10 days after it took place.